Intellectual Property is proudly brought to you by Adams & Adams, rooted in 100 years of excellence in intellectual property law.
Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Intellectual Property Show. According to a survey of 125 IT managers in the UK, 94% of companies currently have no measures in place to stop confidential information from leaving their organization via email. I'm joined in studio tonight by Dr. James Blake from Mimecast to talk about this issue. James, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you very much.
James, essentially email started off very much as a productivity tool, communication. It was a good thing. And suddenly we're sitting with a lot of spam, a lot of frustrations. You can't get work done because there's too many emails to look at. What is Mimecast's business? How do you address these issues?
Well, that's exactly the business that Mimecast is in. Email is a double-edged sword, as you've mentioned already. It's one of the most key productivity tools that are used today, embedded in almost every single workflow there is within an organisation. But there's a whole host of differing threats that have grown up over the years since the first use of email. So we have.
What is the biggest threat at the moment?
I think the biggest threat at the moment is loss of intellectual property. That's one of the key ones, purely because industry isn't very well equipped to deal with it at the moment. The actual solutions you need to put in place to deal with that are quite difficult to put in place. But also, we've got all the old threats of spam, phishing and malware still there, chugging away in the background.
Let's take them one step at a time. Just in terms of you mentioned loss of intellectual property via email. Mm-hmm. So email has become a way of communicating, giving instructions, recording discussions. So if I want to go afterwards and say, but what did we actually agree to and so forth, a lot of that is captured in email.
Yep, that's absolutely true. I mean, if you look at the fact, especially in UK law, anything written in an email is actually classed as a contract. If there's an email between two parties which are legally able to form a contract, anything contained within the email can form a contract or a deviation from an existing contract. So imagine you've got a contractual relationship with a business partner and you make a joke in an email. That could later, if situations change, come back and haunt you.
So that could be a huge loss to an organization if everything that you've recorded, all your contracts with your clients, if suddenly that had to be lost and, exactly if there's a dispute and you want to go back to it and you can't find it, it's a huge challenge. Yeah,
I think there's two particular issues there that you've brought up. One is, what if we lose that data? What if we lose data about the informal contractual agreements that you've come up with, which aren't recorded on paper anywhere, but were formed via email? And the other element of it is, let's say we get into a civil dispute. How do I defend my position? If the person that was my business partner or was my customer suddenly, turns to civil litigation. So there's two strong causes for keeping email, and also there's a lot of intellectual property embedded within email. Email is the process where an awful lot of work gets done. You tend to find the document that eventually gets committed to a document management system is the finished article. What you lose are all those track changes and all the changes to the document over time that really represent the whole process of...
So if I engage with a service provider and I give them instructions, say we, for example, developing a new product or a new business, that development process is basically capturing a conversation. And you give inputs, I give inputs, and we derive to come to a new solution. The only place we can find the recording of that, in a lot of instances, would be email.
Yes, that's for sure. I mean, what you're losing by only keeping the finished document is the work that's gone into that document.
It's the final process.
Yeah. So just to give you an instance, we have one of the largest management consultancies in the United Kingdom stores their email with ourselves, and they treat that email store as an intellectual property, a business intelligence database. And so what happens is when they're working for a similar customer, they're able to cut out 80% of their work because they can go back and look at the track changes and all the changes in the conversational emails before the final contract was finalised, and then they're able to reuse it.
You mentioned the issue of a civil litigation. It's nice to have the internet because the world is becoming a smaller place, but exactly because of that, you would find yourself engaging with people that might not be in the same legal jurisdiction. So how do I deal with that? I'm in South Africa. I send you an email in London. Now we have a dispute. What happens?
Well, the interesting thing is it depends what the contractual arrangements were. So, for instance, if your original contract was formed under UK law, and, for instance, the contract as a part of the clause says, any litigation will happen under a UK court, then any email you've sent will form a deviation for that contract regardless of what the law says within South Africa. Likewise, if the contract is under South African law, whatever the contract law relating to South Africa would cover that legislation. But the most important thing is if you're dealing with US companies, because that is a heavily regulated market, and you can find yourself exposed to all sorts of governance and other forms of legislation as well by dealing with US companies.
Now, I can imagine if you're in a company, obviously the more people you have in the company, the bigger the problem becomes. So if I'm in a company and I like using Outlook and another guy likes using Gmail, for example, and so forth, how do I manage that? What can I do to be on top of the matter?
Well, it's impossible. In that circumstances, when you're using a completely fragmented email infrastructure, there's no way to we like to use the term governance. It's a horrible term because it covers so much. But basically what governance is proving that the policies and procedures that your organisation are taking are stuck to. Yeah. And it's almost impossible to do that because you can't enforce a policy when you're trying to use 6 or 7 different platforms to doing it. We find that when people are using webmail and on-premise mail, but also when they're just trying to manage the risks to their business using several different products within their own infrastructure. So the key thing to do is to think about your email policy and what your contractual obligations are, and then work from there to actually how you deliver email and all of the services around email.
Okay. As a final question, creating awareness within the company to create some kind of maybe a disclaimer at the bottom of an email and so forth. How do you see that working for people?
Well, I think one of the important things about disclaimers is you might need to change your disclaimer to the territories where you're sending email to cope with the law in those particular territories. So having a system which can change the disclaimer dynamically depending on where the email is going, maybe also the type of organisation it's going to, whether it's a partner, a customer, and maybe even changing it for an attachment. So a particular attachment is attached to an email. You change the disclaimer to say the attached document is not to be disclosed to anyone outside your organisation. Having the flexibility to do that is very important in the solution.
Just James, I said final question, but just confirmation as well. Mimecast as a company, you also got a strong South African link, is that so?
Yes, the 2 founders of our company, even though they're now resident in the United Kingdom, are both South African. So Peter Bauer and Neil Murray came over pretty much at the turn of the millennium to try their hand at British business, and they've done extremely well so far. So.
Thank you very much, James, for joining me in the studio tonight, and hopefully I can see email is a big problem. It's just going to get bigger, but Mimecast Technologies maybe help us to address these issues. Thanks for visiting us with us in South Africa. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
That's all we have time for tonight. Tune again next week, same time, from me, Stefan Lamprecht. Good evening.
Intellectual Property was proudly brought to you by Adams & Adams, rooted in 100 years of excellence in intellectual property law.